But besides from heuristics, they're not the only thing that contribute to our systematic errors. There's also this concept called biases, which I'm guessing you've heard of. In fact, I think quite appropriately, most of us have developed a bias against the word bias, and it's because we tend to associate it with some of the less appealing aspects of our species' nature. But in truth, biases merely describe a tendency, and they're neither good nor bad. I could have a bias towards eating food instead of lead. So that's probably a pretty good bias. Or I could have a bias to want to give up my seat to someone who looks uncomfortable on the subway. That's a good bias. So biases by themselves are not bad. They're just tendencies where we just get an immediate feeling that allows us to skip past having to think. Now, it's appealing to call us lazy and to think of human beings as lazy in this regard, but that's really misleading, because if we weren't lazy, again, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have made it. We need to think and fast forward, oftentimes, even for our own safety and protection. Nonetheless, while sometimes it works for us, very often it works against us. And so some of the descriptions up here, stereotypes, I think we're all familiar with. Confirmation bias describes the process whereby when you're taking in new information, if it confirms what you already believe, you're likely to embrace that information. But if it challenges what you already believe, you're likely to reject that information, which describes why when Republicans and Democrats speak with each other, nobody hears anything, because they're only using the information that supports their case. So there's a couple of more biases, but there's one that feels particularly relevant to today, and that is, in fact, gender bias. And the reality is that whether we're consciously aware of it, there are feelings that aren't really processed and aren't considered logically, nonetheless, that hold powerful sway. And they drive our interactions, they drive our perceptions, and unfortunately, they lead us to making some systemic errors. And as a result, there are kind of two different paths that I think that we can take once we realize that this is happening. One is, of course, just increasing awareness. The more that we understand what's happening and that we're aware of it, the more likely we are to notice it and to start taking action to improve on it. But the other is sometimes, I would consider that one almost more like defense, like trying to stop this thing from happening. But sometimes you also have to go on offense, which means that when you're in the midst of pursuing your goals, if this is something that's going to get in your way, then we need to have a plan for how are we going to bypass this stuff. And so we're going to be talking about that in just a little while. So what is behavioral economics? Behavioral economics is really, it exists on two levels, which I just mentioned. The first is using the scientific method to identify and validate that these things exist. Different heuristics that all human beings employ, different biases that human beings show with great consistency and reliability. And so the science of identifying those is obviously hugely important, because we can't address something until we understand it. But then the question becomes, well, what are you going to do with that knowledge and information? And that is the applied side of behavioral economics. It's part of what I do and a lot of other behavioral economists do, is we take this knowledge that we have and we look at different situations and say, how can we use our understanding of how human beings behave or how they think in order to be as effective as we possibly can, particularly, and for the ethical behavioral economists, to help people avoid making choices that work against their own self-interests. And that's why behavioral economics has become very important in public health, in public policy. It also, on the somewhat darker side, has become very important in advertising and marketing. But one of the delineations there, when you're thinking about this science and this practice, is, are you trying to help someone make a decision that's good for them, or are you trying to help someone make a decision that's good for you? this is an unfortunate reality of our field. It's not a question of whether or not people would try to use behavioral economics against your own self-interest. It's been happening for decades. So what we can do about it is, one, spread awareness of it just so that it is less likely to be effective. And then the other is for practitioners, be open about it. For me, as I mentioned earlier, there has been research done, and letting people know about the behavioral economics techniques that you're trying to use does not impact their effectiveness. And so one way to tell an ethical behavioral economist is when they're pointing out exactly what they're doing, trying to help people make the best decisions.